jump and play. Curious George, the curious little monkey. Let's go see what he's doing today.
Curious George goes to a surprise party. George, said the man with the yellow hat, today is Tommy's birthday. I'll wrap his present, and then we can go. Soon they were off in the little blue car. Tommy's mother greeted them at the door. She looked worried. I don't know what to do, she said. Chuckles the clown is sick and can't come to Tommy's party. Don't worry, said the man. I'll phone for another clown. George, you help Mrs. Reynolds, but don't get into trouble. And he went upstairs. George, said Mrs. Reynolds, I've got some work to do in the house. Why don't you go out to the yard and hang the balloons? A ball of string, a pair of scissors, and a bunch of balloons were on a table. George started to blow them up one by one. Then he climbed up a tree to tie them on. Soon, the balloons were hanging from the trees. What next? Mrs. Reynolds' laundry was in a basket under the clothesline. George got the scissors and cut a circle out of Mrs. Reynolds' blue jeans. Next, he cut a star out of a yellow sheet. Next, a square from Mrs. Reynolds' striped blouse. And finally, a triangle from Tommy's shorts. Then he took the 4 pieces and hung them on the clothesline. That looked pretty. Just then, Mrs. Reynolds came out. My clothes, she cried. They're ruined. What have you done, George? It was time to get away. George ran into the house and hid under a table. It was the table with all the presents for Tommy. After a while, George peeked out. The coast was clear. There were lots of boxes on the table, wrapped up in colored paper and tied with ribbons. One big box was open. What was in it? George was curious. He peeked inside. Then he climbed in. Suddenly, he heard someone coming in and quickly pulled the cover over. Let's get the presents outside, said Mrs. Reynolds. I'll take the biggest one. My, it's heavy, she said. It must be something special. Let's all hide, said Mrs. Reynolds. And when Tommy gets here, we'll come out and yell, surprise! A few minutes later, Tommy came out. Surprise, they yelled. What was going on? George was curious. He pushed up the top of the box and popped out. It's George, cried a girl. What a birthday present. Everybody laughed and cheered. This is the best party I ever had, said Tommy. And you were better than the clown, Tommy's mother said to George, even if you did ruin some of my clothes. Just then, the man with the yellow hat came into the yard. I'm sorry, but I couldn't find a clown, he said. Never mind the clown, said Mrs. Reynolds. George made up for it. Why don't you join us? And so he did. Everyone had a good time, even George. When George and his friend had finished their cake, they waved goodbye and drove home.